and cutting your head.
The kids know this love story.
Welcome to Canada.
Is about to go down in history.
911, what's your emergency?
Did she murder her daughter?
No one asked why.
Welcome to Bollywood.
In Kenya, water is life.
We have good news for you.
My heart is like skipping beats.
It's not easy living up to my standards.
We're looking for the next global drag superstar.
It's astonishing.
I'm going to tell you a story.
Dirty money and dodgy people.
Go big or go home.
Who's ready for world domination?
Good morning. Okay, thank you.
Good morning.
So hi, my name is Leah-Simone Bowen. I am a host of Podcast Playlist on CBC Radio 1, and I also co-host, along with Phelan Johnson, the podcast Secret Life of Canada, which is a history podcast. And I'm happy to be here moderating this morning to talk to the team from inside the Statue Wars. So I want to welcome Elizabeth St. Philip.
Thank you.
Yuma Hester and Steve Gamester here. How are you all doing this morning?
Doing well. Doing quite well.
Excellent. We've all had our coffee. Great. But before we get into this discussion today, I want to just throw to the trailer so that everyone, in case you haven't seen the film we're about to talk about, you have a bit of context. So let's just see the trailer.
From 2020, there was this giant wave of pulling down statues that spread across the world. Canada has this image of this very orderly country, and yet actually quite a high number of statues were pulled down.
For this action, I'm gonna get my ass in trouble. Police are gonna come and knock on my door the next day.
He didn't deserve that. It's a distortion of history.
These aren't just statues to some people. This is lived violence.
I've dreamt of that statue going down for years.
Queen Victoria presided over some of the most brutal moments in history.
Is Canada perfect? No. But Canada's a great country. If I don't like a statue, just give me the right to take a sledgehammer to it.
When you have decades upon decades of asking nicely, citizens take matters into their own hands.
We're standing beside the sarcophagus of Johnny MacDonald.
How do you say it without sounding like a racist? Yeah, I think as a builder of our country, we owe him more than ripping down his statue.
If I tear down your sculpture and the head falls off of a colonial leader, get over it.
My message to settler Canadians is that your anger towards Indigenous people is misdirected. This country was built on genocide.
The spirit of my ancestors, they were here first. People are getting fed up with this. We want reconciliation, but you're stuffing this down our throat.
If the government is not willing to take action, then it's up to the people.
I firmly believe there will be a backlash. Is this what it means to be an Indian in this country?
What kind of statues do we want representing us as a country?
That's why we pulled down that statue.
In my mind, it was absolutely a criminal act.
This is our victory, our trophy of war.
Wow. So we're here to really have a discussion about collaboration, how you came together, how the production went, and good relationship. But I want to just get a little bit of context about how this project came together. And Elizabeth, I'd love to start with you. You directed and co-produced this film. Can you tell us about how you all landed on this particular subject matter to cover right now?
Well, we came from it from different perspectives. I'll start with, since you're starting with me, I'll start with my own. I'm a journalist by training, and I've always been quite fascinated about
these statues that came down in 2020 and 2021, they usually appeared as sort of like little news clips or on social media. People would say these are vandals, it's vandalism, but I was always really intrigued at finding out more, like why are people actually taking down these statues? And I had just started working at Saloon, and Steve Gamester, who is like, we worked together on a previous documentary, 9/11 Kids, and Steve, he'll tell you much more, but he's a history buff, and he was always interested in what these statues represented, but I'll let him kind of take it from there. But we were working together. We had been collaborators on another documentary, and when Steve came up with the idea to do this, I was intrigued because I really wanted to dig deeper into this subject, and then I will let Yuma tell his own story as how he came to join us. But I started with curiosity and interest and wanting to collaborate with Steve again on another really exciting project.
It's interesting because, Steve, I read that you've worked a lot for the History Channel. You have I think you have an MA in history. Okay. But I also heard that the History Channel, while you're working there, said never film a statue. They're very boring. Is that true?
Yeah, that is true. I had a boss at History Channel. I worked there from 2001 to 2009, and she had a rule: never let a producer film a statue or a plaque or a monument because they're so boring.
So how did you land on this? After that great training, how did you land on the fact that you wanted to do something about statues?
Well, it turns out they're much more interesting if people are tearing them down.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind that Elizabeth called me history buff. History geek might be more of an accurate word, but I tend to be hyper aware when people are paying attention to history. And, such a moment happened in 2020, 2021. There were kind of two things that I think triggered the round of statue toppling. One was the murder of George Floyd in the United States, which led to people taking down monuments across the United States, a lot of Confederate monuments, which has its own fascinating story. And then in Canada, it was the discovery of the unmarked graves in Kamloops, the residential school. And I think there was sort of a collective feeling in the country that enough was enough, that something had to happen. It was also, of course, during the pandemic. And about 250 memorials and statues came down around the world, about 20 in Canada. And it just struck Elizabeth and I, and later when we started talking to Yuma, that this was fascinating, that statues provided this window into a reckoning we were having with our history. And, statues had been torn down in the past. I mean, anyone old enough to remember the fall of the Berlin Wall saw the statues of Lenin and Stalin coming down, or the statue of Saddam Hussein come down during the Gulf War. But this was different. It was global, and it was largely a reckoning with, in the Canadian context in particular, with the impacts of colonialism, which we found really interesting as a way into this story.
And Yuma, I'm just wondering, so you were a DOP and a co-producer on this as well. I'm wondering if you can tell us your interest in this subject matter, what it is, and how you came to be involved in the project.
Yeah, thank you. So good morning, everybody. My name is Yuma Hester, and my mom's side of the family comes from Neashingaming, otherwise known as Cape Croker, which is on the Georgian Bay. And my dad's side of the family comes from Moose Factory by way of Waskaganish, so on the Quebec side. And my family has lived in and around Southern Ontario, I would say, for the better part of the last 60, 70 years now. So, and the primary vocation that my family has been in community development. And I sort of take that on myself. In my last role, I worked with children and youth and fostered relationships with over 30 communities in Ontario and Manitoba. So I always bring that sense to the work. And basically, at one point, I think Steve and Elizabeth were looking for an Indigenous voice to help out with the project. So I think that was probably about a year ago now, maybe a bit over a year now, when they approached, and the subject matter, the material was just too like enticing not to jump on right away. I think it was such a great arena to be able to delve into a lot of these issues that Indigenous people are currently facing, and like the ongoing legacy of colonialism. And I thought this is such a terrific entry point into a lot of that subject matter. So.
And you hadn't all three worked together before this project. No. So Yuma, I'm wondering, when you enter into a project like this and you don't know, you've never worked with these two collaborators before, and you work in community building, and you work in building relationships and maintaining good ties, how do you approach then working within something like this to ensure that those relationships stand after the project?
Absolutely. I think you nailed it. Like, essentially, through work you foster relationships, and you have to cultivate them, and you have to continually sort of like, it's not, I think, especially in the world of doc making, it's not, I'm going to feature you in this doc, and you're from a community. It's like some of the things that were very, very intentional was, one example, my wife, shameless plug, and my sister have a jewelry making business. And what they did is they prepared gifts for each of the guests that we went and did interviews with, so that we brought tobacco and medicines to each of the participants who we were interviewing, along with a gift to ensure, those relationships were started in the right way. Just as one example.
Wow. I would like to be featured in your next film as well, just for that. That's amazing. And so it really struck me watching this, and he was in the trailer, Lawrence, he's an artist, is in this film, and I could feel his emotion come through every time he spoke. And so I'm wondering how you are able to make an interviewee feel that safe, especially in front of a camera when people aren't maybe comfortable in front of a camera. How do you ensure their safety so that they can really speak their truth? Either.
I think in terms of that question, for me, it's always important to try to build a relationship with people. So a lot of that work starts obviously before we even show up to do an interview. So conversations on the phone and talking about not just the documentary, but their feelings about the issue, and like letting them get to know me. And I think it's just like any relationship. It takes time. It takes trust. You can't assume the trust is going to be there right away. Like, a lot of people don't trust legacy media. Like, this is appearing on CBC, and it had come up before. Like, among many of our subjects, they were concerned about how their stories would be treated.
From the CBC, really?
Yeah,
I've
from
never
the
heard
CBC.
that before. That's shocking.
But from both sides,
Yeah.
from
Yes, of
the
course,
Indigenous side as well as people who want to keep up the statues who appeared in our documentary. And so I think it's just taking the time to speak with people and just not be extractive. Like, I think sometimes people go into documentaries or filmmaking wanting to get something from somebody, and it's not. Well, for me and for the team here, it's not about that. We recognize that people are sharing their stories with us, that it's a gift, that there is no documentary without them. And giving them the time to get to know us and feel like they will feel safe in our presence. And so all of that work happens before we appear.
And so how, I know it's hard to generalize like this, but when you're chasing and you're trying to get guests and interviewees talk about this kind of subject matter that might be quite personal to them, how long does it usually take from sending that first email or maybe doing that first phone call to actually having them sit in front of you and filming them?
Months and months and months and
Okay.
months. And sometimes up until the very end. I mean, there are certain people in the documentary that we weren't sure we would get them. Like it takes a long time. Some people, yeah, like, I don't know, one of our subjects, like, was it over half a year, maybe more, from the first initial contact until she's a they, them, appeared on camera, so.
Did everyone say yes that you
No.
approached? No.
Lots,
Okay.
we heard a lot of no's, which, I think is, anyone who's made a film, you hear a lot of no's. And, watching Jennifer's amazing talk this morning, that you have to give people what they need to bring them into a project. I think those are such wise words. And, my background, I'm a settler Canadian. My family comes from England and Scotland. A lot of the statues that appear in this film, a lot of the statues that have been brought down come from my culture. So, I found myself speaking to a lot of the people on that side of this discussion to try and convince them to talk about why these statues meant something to them. We wanted to have the different perspectives because this is a national debate. And so many people said no. They were afraid that, they were going to be set up as being racist, and that, their perspective was old school, or whatever the reasons were. And it was interesting to me because a lot of these people were on the public record in publications with their views, but there is something about putting a camera on someone, which I appreciate as a different experience. So it was, the subject is a difficult one. I think for a lot of people, most of the statues in this country only tell one side of history. And that's the problem. A lot of Canadians have had the luxury and the privilege of ignoring the cruelty of someone like John A. Macdonald, because that cruelty created the country that they benefited from. But in Canada in 2023, it is our responsibility to confront this history. And I don't think everyone is prepared to do that.
Still, hey?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I'm wondering, maybe Yuma, you can start here. Do you have any, let's get down to brass tacks. Do you have any tips, because I love a tip, for people when they're entering into collaborations, maybe with other creators that they haven't worked with before? What are the tips that you have on how to problem solve when you're working with new collaborators?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't really have a great answer for that, other than, like
I feel like no one does. That's
No, that's a tough one.
I'm like, I don't have that answer either.
That's a good one. I mean, other than internal mechanisms that you have, like essentially, so I'm part of a collective of Indigenous and non-Indigenous artists. We're called Bowen Collective. You should follow us on social media if you're not following us. So we work with non-Indigenous people, and generally we try to collaborate with them for a period of time before continuing to work. And in that time period, you get a sense of people who are genuinely there to help. People who, I'm sure everybody else has sort of people in their lives who genuinely want to see you succeed and genuinely want to help you. And it's those people you keep close, right? Those are the people who become your closest, people that you want to work with and collaborate with and build stuff with and create with as often as possible. And then I think those relationships become reciprocal, it's the desire to help them, I think, comes out naturally as well. And Steve and Elizabeth, almost immediately stood out as those types of people for me. So as far as that question, I think internal measures and seeing people who really wanted to help, I think we're big markers.
And Elizabeth, I know that you mentioned that you and Steve had worked together before on 9/11 Kids, which everyone should watch. I watched it 2 days ago. It's excellent. Every project that you work on, I'm sure you learn something. What did this one, Inside the Statue Wars, teach you for next time? Like, what was the big takeaway for next time when you work together?
Wow, the big takeaway for next time. I'm gonna have to ponder that. I guess, I mean, I don't know, this is not a new takeaway, but I'll use it.
Takeaway?
A takeaway. I think always be ready to throw out your assumptions about a topic. You know, like I have my own biases because of how I was raised and how I see the world, and just knowing that when you start a topic, you might have an expectation of it going a certain way, and it usually does not, and being comfortable with that and going with it. A little bit of background on me, like I was raised by a single mother. She was an immigrant from Grenada, a teacher, and for her, Canada was the greatest country in the world. She's no longer with us, but that was something that I was raised believing. And you know, I still think we have a very good country, but doing this project, it really drove home the fact that it's the greatest country in the world, perhaps for some, but for many, many people is the opposite. It is not that at all. And that is something that's a truth, and I recognized it even more going through this documentary. And so I think, I mean, that's just one example for this doc, being willing to put aside my biases, my assumptions, and kind of being open and receptive to what the documentary and what people are going to teach me.
What were your takeaways?
Well, there were a couple. I mean, you know, my father went to Ryerson, my mother went to Ryerson, my best friend went to Ryerson, my wife went to Ryerson. So that name and that word was a word, a name of pride in my household growing up. So, you know, I think a mature approach to history is being able to swallow your pride and to understand how your pride puts blinders on the way that you look at your story in the context of your country or your community. And you have to find ways to look beyond that. And it, you know, the other thing that was really important to me in this project was to step back. You know, I got into this business to travel, to go to interesting places.
That's very
and
honest
to
of
meet
you.
interesting people. I mean, that is one of the great things of working in this business is that, you know, you find yourself in these situations, you're like, what am I doing here? This is amazing. And in this project, I really understood that I had to step back, that I really had to let Elizabeth and Yuma lead in the field. And, you know, that's hard as a creator. You know, you want to be there. You want to be there for those moments because it's the exciting time. And this was the project where I learned to step back. And that's why these partnerships are so essential, to really get to know people, to trust them, to understand what everyone's strengths are, to make the space for every person to have their say, but to understand that the project is really what you're all working towards. You know, at the risk of using a very colonial term, the project is king and queen. And you have to put your own personal interests secondary to that, and you have to trust your colleagues in your creation together.
Yeah. Yuma, what were your takeaways?
I had a few. So I think the main one, if I could speak to the subject matter, was it's a strong realization of how small the Indigenous voice is within Canada. That was weirdly surprising. I know it shouldn't be. A good example of that is Saul Mamakwa, for example, who's like one MP. Is he MP or an MPP? MPP? So one MPP who's sort of fighting for what's right, and that's to take down the John A. statue at Queen's Park, for example, because he knows it's harmful to Indigenous people to have to see that and walk by that every day. But he's one of like hundreds of people within the office, you know, and to me, it speaks to a failure in democracy, because they'll take it to a vote or they'll have like a referendum, and of course everybody's going to vote to keep it up or to do something else with it. So again, it was sort of like that learning point. But I think the other personal piece for me was, you know, like we're just a fledgling production house based out of, you know, like Hamilton.
Bowen, you're talking about
Bowen, yeah. So we're just like a small production house in Hamilton. So being able to be on a production obviously was a massive learning experience. It accelerated like everything for myself anyway, you know, and some of those lessons to the crew as well that I work with. But gained years basically being involved in a production at this level, and then also being able to see the mechanism of the larger organization of CBC, for example. Like I remember we turned in an edit of the film, and I think the film was very much like sort of targeted at the story less heard, the Indigenous side of the story, and it was very heavy. I would say the majority of it essentially was that perspective. And it got rejected, quote unquote. It got sent back basically, and they said, just take a look at this and see and adjust it. Maybe Elizabeth can add to kind of this context.
What did they want to adjust?
Yeah, I think that's a good question for my colleague.
Thank you, Yuma.
Absolutely.
I think, I mean, the title of the documentary is Inside the Statue Wars, and I think from the broadcaster's perspective, they wanted to see a little bit more of the war. Not to say that, you know, there wasn't a true war, but there are people on opposite sides of this issue. And so the cut that we sent back was more of that. So it still had a very strong Indigenous voice, like the Indigenous perspective was in it, but the first cut was more all of that. It was like sort of fully the Indigenous perspective, whereas the documentary that ultimately, you know, you see on television had people who were opposed to it. And I think the reason for that is these are the conversations and arguments that people are having in their homes right now about this issue. Like, well, maybe not right now, probably talking about other things, but the issue of taking down statues or keeping them up, that was a conversation. There are a lot of people in the country who want the statues to stay up, and I think ultimately CBC, the broadcaster, wanted to hear from that, to hear a little bit about that tension. And that's the documentary that ultimately we put in. And I actually think at the end of the day, it was probably the appropriate choice because it's a conversation. I mean, you know, to Steve's point, people didn't care about the statues until they came down. But it was an opportunity to start talking about these issues. And I think that's a good thing because even if we don't agree, we all share this country and we have to find a way of having these conversations. And so ultimately, I'm hoping the documentary helped us with that.
I have a couple more questions and then I'm gonna open it up to the audience in case you have any questions. Please think of them now so that you can fire them off. I'm just wondering, Steve, if you can speak to really how long this took from pitching it to it being greenlit and the production itself.
Sure. Well, it began down the street, actually. If anyone lives in this general area, you might remember there was a statue in the village of a historical figure named Alexander Wood. And that statue...
Many feel that way.
That statue was taken down in April 2022. And it was... I was sort of surprised by it because, you know, it seems like a very progressive statue, right? It was a statue that was in the village of someone who had been persecuted for their sexual orientation. And I wanted to know more about that story. Also because the way it came down was so sudden. It was, you know, just one day a crew showed up and took it down and many people in the community were like, well, what happened? So that was in, I believe, April 2022. And I think that day I came in and talked to Elizabeth, hey, did you see this? We should really do something about the statues. So we took it to CBC, and you know, it was that reaction that every filmmaker dreams of. It's the only time I've ever heard this, where they said, we can't believe no one's done this film yet. When you hear something like that, you know you've got a shot. You know? And you know, as mentioned, Elizabeth and I just made 9/11 Kids, so we took it to CBC, and again, this is the only time this has ever happened to me, where two different teams in CBC were sort of fighting over the topics. That's when we really knew we might be onto something here. So we did a round of development, and which was absolutely essential for a project like this. You know, we really needed to dive deep into consultations in the communities to understand this issue. It also gave us an opportunity to meet Yuma and to bring him into the team. So the development period was, I think, April to October of 2022. And then we began pre-production in November of 2022 and delivered the film in August this year. So I guess the full time was about a year and a half, and production itself about 9, 10 months.
That sounds right. And actually, in terms of like Steve is right, in terms of the development is completely essential. But the funny thing about the green light, it was probably the fastest green light that I've ever been involved in. It came like after we had handed in our package. I don't know, like it was a few weeks later. Like that often doesn't happen that quickly. So I think they were excited about the topic.
And we one last thing to add to that, you know, we were like, oh, for sure there'll be another statue toppling while we're filming. There wasn't. So, you know, we were really hoping. I mean, you know, you know, as any filmmaker, you want action, you want your stories. We wanted to follow things as they happened, and there were no statue topplings while we made this film, which obviously was a challenge.
So how did you deal with that challenge?
Anyone else want to take that one?
Well, we sourced a lot of interesting video from past topplings. Like, you know, Ryerson, there was some great video that hadn't been shown before, that we got that. We got some new video for the toppling in Victoria for the Captain Cook statue. So kind of bringing those past topplings to life and then speaking to the people who were involved in taking them down. So we did it that way.
What was the easiest thing that you encountered on this project? Was it just the green lighting? Was there anything else that surprised you that was just super easy when you were doing this? Because we always talk about the hard things. I'm just wondering what the easy things were. Zero response.
I can go for that. I mean, the easiest thing for me, I think, was the green light was cool. Yeah. The green light was quick. I mean, you guys have more experience than I do with that, but I think, I know it's terrible to say, I don't think we had much conflict. I think even throughout the entire process and the development and, you know, sitting in the room and writing everything on cue cards, and we didn't experience that much conflict. And I think we all sort of had similar visions, or at least a safe space to share ideas and have open and honest communication.
That's great.
Yeah, definitely. Like the team, like we worked really well together. And Joel Schechter, who is our editor, who isn't here, like, again, when he came on board, like, it was really great collaborating. You know, it was a great experience. So that part was easy.
What was hard?
Finding the head of Egerton Ryerson. It's still out there. I really wanted to call the film, Bring Me the Head of Egerton Ryerson. I got vetoed on that one. But we still don't know well.
Somebody knows where it is. We know who knows where it is.
Interesting. Okay, interesting. So I want to just open it up now to see if anyone has any questions. Is there any questions? If so, you can just raise your hand. Yes.
I'm curious. We live in such a, I would say, PC culture. Woke culture has become very prominent in our society. Do you think that's fueled the industry of documentaries like these, or do you think it's hurt it because everyone has a forum to kind of speak their minds, and sometimes those opinions don't really matter because they're not backed by context? So do you think that's helping your industry or hurting it?
That is such a good question. You know, that should have been the answer to what was the hardest. You know, I don't love this term, but for ease of everyone understanding, we live in an age of the culture wars. And, I think as documentary filmmakers, we have to be brave in entering that debate. I really do. And it doesn't come without risk. So I think, the answer to your question from my perspective is yes and no. I think yes in the sense that it's fantastic. Like, I think statue topplings are healthy. I really do. I think that it is a sign of a country reckoning with its history, and that these discussions are fundamentally important if we're going to create a level playing field in society. But on the other hand, I mean, I think one of the risks of statue toppling is the slippery slope. Can I still listen to Michael Jackson's music? Can I still admire Pablo Picasso's art? How do we live in an age of too much biography, where we know every detail about everyone. Human beings are fundamentally flawed. There's a reason in our culture we have the saying, don't put someone on a pedestal. And I think we have to be forgiving in having this debate. I come from a European privileged background. The founding of Canada has meant enormous benefits for my family, and I'm going to say things sometimes that are insensitive. And I'm, really want to have a lifelong journey in trying to improve and trying to make a level playing field in this society. But I'm going to say some things sometimes that are insensitive. And there is a fear that, that someone will, how do you say this?
Be offended.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think we have to have an honest conversation, and we have to listen to each other and not always jump to conclusions, I think is maybe the best way I can put it.
Thank you. I think, yes, back there.
Hi, good morning.
Hello.
My name is Judith. My question is kind of like a question and maybe a query. So to Elizabeth and to, is it Yuma and Steve, whoever wants to answer. You said that when you were doing cuts and you sent it, they asked you to, I guess, put more kind of like intensifying content. Do you think that would be to stir the pot so it wouldn't look bad on the government, just in regards to saying, well, it's the people's referendum, not the government's referendum, like saying this is what the people want, not the government per se? Like, do you understand my question?
I think so. I mean, I would say, just take a step back for a second. Like, I think in terms of like the first cut we sent in, the comments back, or the direction was to go back and reflect. We weren't given an explicit directive like put more of this person in at all. It was more like the documentary was inside the statue wars. Is there a way to present a cut that is more reflective of that title? So I think they trusted us to be able to go back and think about the material we had to kind of provide that story. So I don't know if I'm completely answering your question. I think it was more, the expectation for the doc was that there was going to be more of a conflict, or more of a two sides to this issue. And I think it was just going back and trying to extract from the material we had to present that. But I don't know if I completely answered your question. But
Yes and no, because I was thinking, because like sometimes, a lot of times the government doesn't want to do certain things. So with the title, and then with the way that you guys did this segment, like in regards to the documentary, it would speak that it's the people, like it's more like this is what the people of the country want, or the different genres, like this is what everybody is fighting for, or this is what everybody's taking a stance for. So it kind of looks more like, well, if they go along with it, like external looking in, be like, well, this is what the people want. So we're gonna kind of like, it's like a cushion for the government, so it doesn't look bad on them, but more so it's what the people want. Am I making?
I think if I'm understanding the question, is sort of like, is the question sort of about whether the first cut was sort of too much of an anti-establishment kind of a piece, or sort of an anti-Canadian kind of?
No, I think
or
because
like,
of.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, because of what you guys have conveyed in the documentary, and it is it's a subject that's kind of like taboo. Nobody wants to talk about it, or nobody wants to take onus for the material, or for the feelings, or for the voices that are being spoken. I'm saying, like, in regards to maybe you, like, subconsciously you just added that piece in, but as I was watching it, it kind of like prompted me to say, well, it sounds like it's a more like the people referendum, what the people want to see the government do, because toppling, what do you call it? Toppling statues is typically, it's a crime, right?
It's illegal.
So,
yeah.
Yeah, it's illegal. So that's why I'm saying it seems like it's more the government would look at it, or be. It's kind of like a cushion piece in the sense that this is what the people want. We want you to take responsibility. We're toppling these things not because it's to make it be a crime, but because it's the crimes that were committed against us, type of thing.
Right.
So to make it look like the government, to take responsibility, but it's more coming from like the people.
From the
like for them to put their
grassroots.
foot out there and say, we're going to stand behind you.
Yeah.
Like, that's what I got by watching that.
That's,
Sorry.
Thank you very much for that. No, I think that's a wonderful perspective, and I think for me anyway, I don't want to speak for my other two co-producers, though. I personally don't think there was ever a strong sort of this is what needs to happen sort of thread through the documentary itself. You know, I think we did our best to try to get as much of a diverse sort of opinion of what should happen as possible, and even some of the people, like there's Indigenous people who say that statues should be kept up. Like Jeff Thomas, for example, is somebody who believes that they should stay up for education purposes. You know, there's non-Indigenous people that say they should come down. And I think that was at least our goal anyway, was to try to at least present that and not necessarily have a piece that was like, this is what the people are saying, or, you know, that's my interpretation.
Thanks. I want to make some time for a couple more questions. Yes. No more questions. No more questions. Oh, I had 2 more minutes. Okay, I thought I had 2 more minutes. So we'll have to wrap it up there. I just want to thank you all for being here today. Elizabeth,
Thank you
Steve,
so much.
Yuma, and thank you so much for this film.
Thank
I
you,
really
everyone.
enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you.